Welcome to this video. Today, we will talk about one of the most dangerous viruses that humankind has been exposed to, namely the Spanish flu in the beginning. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive all new Spanish flu. The 1918 influenza pandemic, or what is known as the Spanish flu or the Spanish incoming, is a deadly flu pandemic that spread in the aftermath of the First World War in Europe and the world and left millions of dead. The virus is characterized by the speed of infection, as recent statistics estimate that about 500 million people have become infected and have shown clear clinical signs, and between 50 to 100 million people have died from the disease, equivalent to twice as many as died in World War I. The vast majority of the victims of this epidemic were adults and healthy adolescents, in contrast to what usually happens that the epidemic targets the elderly, children and sick or vulnerable people. Infectious diseases reduced life expectancy in the early 20th century, but life expectancy in the United States decreased by about 12 years in the first year of the epidemic. Most cases of influenza outbreaks disproportionately kill very young and very old adults, with a higher life expectancy between the two ages, but the Spanish flu pandemic has resulted in a higher than expected mortality rate among young adults. To maintain spirits, wartime oversight curtailed early reports of disease and deaths in Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Newspapers were free to report the effects of the epidemic in neutral Spain, such as the serious illness of King Alfonso XIII. These stories made the wrong impression of Spain as a very strong blow, which led to the epidemic being called the Spanish flu. Scientists offer several possible explanations for the high death rate from the 1918 flu pandemic. Some analyses have shown that the virus is particularly deadly because it causes a cytokine storm, which destroys the stronger immune system in young adults. In contrast, a 2007 analysis of medical journals from the epidemic period found that viral infection was not more potent than previous influenza strains. Instead, malnutrition, overcrowded medical camps, hospitals, and poor hygiene promote additional bacterial infection. This additional infection killed most of the victims, usually after laying down on her deathbed for a certain period. Hypotheses about the source. Researchers have identified the main troop camp in Étaples, France, as the center of the Spanish flu. The research was published by a British team in 1999, led by virologist John Oxford. In late 1917, military pathologists reported the emergence of a new disease with a higher death rate that they later recognized as influenza. The overcrowded camp and hospital was an ideal location for spreading respiratory virus. The hospital treated thousands of victims of chemical attacks and other war injuries. 100,000 soldiers passed through the camp every day. The camp was also home to a live pig barn, and poultry were regularly brought in from neighboring villages for food supplies. Oxford and his team assumed that a basic virus portal, inhabiting birds, mutated and then migrated to pigs near the front of the camp. There were allegations that the origin of the epidemic dates back to the United States. The historian Alfred W. claimed. Crosby said that influenza originated in Kansas, and the famous author John Barry described Haskell County in Kansas as the point of origin. It was also alleged that by late 1917, there was already a first wave of epidemic in at least 14 U.S. military camps. China was one of the few regions in the world that was less affected by the influenza pandemic in 1918, as there was perhaps a relatively light flu season in 1918. There were relatively few influenza deaths in China compared to other regions of the world. This led to speculation that the 1918 flu pandemic arose from China. The relatively mild flu season and low death rates in China in 1918 can be explained by the fact that the Chinese population already has acquired immunity to the influenza virus. Thus, in 1918, China was immune from the great devastation caused by the epidemic, due to the apparent resistance of the virus among the Chinese compared to other regions in the world. Previous hypotheses have made various points of origin for the epidemic. Some have assumed that influenza originated in East Asia, a common region for transmitting the disease from animals to humans due to forceful living conditions. In 1993, Claude Hannon, the lead expert on 1918 influenza at the Pasteur Institute, confirmed that the previous virus came mostly from China. It later developed in the United States near Boston and spread from there to Brest, France, and the battlefields of Europe and the world through Allied soldiers and sailors as the main publishers. She considered that many other hypotheses of origin, which say that the virus came from Spain, Kansas, and Brest, are possible, but not likely. Politician Andrew Price Smith published data from the Austrian archive indicating that influenza originated early, beginning in Austria in early 1917. In 2014, historian Mark Humphreys argued that mobilizing 96,000 Chinese workers to work behind British and French lines might have been the source of the epidemic. Humphreys, from Memorial University in Newfoundland, St. John's, relied on his findings on newly discovered records. He found archival evidence that a respiratory disease that affected northern China in November 1917 was identified a year later by Chinese health officials as identical to the Spanish flu. A report published in 2016 in the Journal of the Chinese Medical Association found no evidence that the 1918 virus was transmitted to Europe by soldiers and workers from Southeast Asia and China. The report found evidence that the virus had spread to European armies for several months and possibly years before the 1918 pandemic. Spread. When an infected person sneezes or coughs, more than 500,000 viral particles spread to everyone next door. Close and large troop movements in World War I caused the epidemic, and this increased the transmission of the virus and increased its mutations. War may be the cause of the increase in the ability of the virus to eliminate infected people. Some speculate that the soldiers' immune systems have been weakened by poor nutrition, as well as combat stress and chemical attacks, increasing their vulnerability. A big factor in this flu occurring globally is increased travel. Modern transportation systems have made it easier for soldiers, sailors, and civilian travelers to spread the disease. In the United States, the disease was first detected in Haskell County, Kansas, in January 1918, prompting local Dr. Loring Minner to warn the American Journal of Public Health Services. On March 4, 1918, Cook disease was reported by Albert Gitchell, of Haskell County, in Fort Riley, an American military facility that was at the time training U.S. forces during World War I, making him the first recorded flu victim. Within days, 522 men had been reported ill in the camp. By March 11, 1918, the virus had reached Queens, New York. He was later criticized for not taking preventive measures in March. In August 1918, a more virulent strain appeared simultaneously in Brest, France, and in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and in the United States in Boston, Massachusetts. The Spanish flu also spread through Ireland, as Irish soldiers returned to it. In World War I, the Allies called the disease the Spanish flu, mainly because the epidemic received greater press attention after its move from France to Spain in November 1918. Spain did not participate in the war and did not impose censorship in wartime. Death rate. The global death rate for the years 1918 and 1919 is unknown, but it is estimated that between 2.5 to 5% of people with the disease have died. Estimation of death numbers also varied. Initial estimates indicated that 40 to 50 million people died as a result of influenza, while current estimates raise this number to 50 to 100 million. This epidemic has been described as the greatest medical holocaust in history and has resulted in deaths that exceeded the harvest of the Black Plague in the 14th century AD. The epidemic claimed about 5% of the total population of India at the time, and the number was estimated at 17 million people. In Japan, it counted more than 23 million cases, resulting in about 390,000 deaths. About 28% of the population in the United States with the disease and claimed the lives of between 500 and 675,000 people. In Britain, more than 250,000 victims were recorded, and in France the number reached 400,000 and about 50,000 patients fell in Canada. Spanish influenza, unlike other flu types, was characterized by its ability to cause fatal complications in people younger than 45 years old. Statistics indicate that 99% of deaths were in people younger than 65 years, and more than half of the deaths were in the age group 20 to 40 years. The main cause of death was asphyxia as a result of pulmonary bleeding or secondary pneumonia. Some believe that the cause of the immunity of the elderly against the Spanish flu is due to their exposure to the Russian flu in 1889, which gave them partial immunity against the virus. The tremendous number of deaths as a result of the high rates of infection, which reached 50% of the population, and the severity of the symptoms of the disease contributed to the high number as a result of the disease caused by the tremendous rise in cytokines inside the body and thus the occurrence of more severe and greater lethal symptoms. History of the epidemic. Although World War I did not directly contribute to the disease, however, the crowded barracks and the massive infantry movements accelerated the epidemic. Some scientists speculated that as a result of the soldiers' malnutrition and exposure to chemicals in the war, their weak immune system turned them into incubators that transmitted the disease across different countries, and some references mention that the epidemic was a reason to tip the Allied forces and a factor in the success of their campaigns in the central regions and their victory in the war. The geographical source of the epidemic. Scientists' first speculation was that the disease arose in the Far East, but author Alfred Cosby chronicled that the first cases appeared in Kansas in the United States, and writer John Barry confirmed Cosby's words about the fact that Kansas was the origin of the disease and that the first cases appeared in March from 1918. However, political writer Andrew Price Smith published documents from the Austrian government archive indicating that the first epidemics appeared in Austria in the spring of 1917. The reason for calling the epidemic Spanish flu. Although the epidemic is called the Spanish flu, it was not issued by Spain, and the reason for the nomination is due to the fact that the Spanish media is concerned about the epidemic as a result of its relative liberation compared to the countries participating in the First World War. Spain was not part of the war, and surveillance was not applied to the Spanish media. Ironically, the Spanish called the French flu an infection.